Now say you fall into another category. Say that outside of work and shopping for groceries and getting gas, you don't participate in any civic institutions. None. You just go to work, then come back home, and maybe binge on Netflix for the rest of the night, and then go to bed. Or you just go to work or school, and then come back home and just jump straight onto the video games. I've been particularly guilty of this one in my teenage years. But if this is the extent of your relationships, you have essentially entered the zone of isolation. So what's all this about? Well, the idea of isolation and alienation, and really loneliness, is that one just absolutely does not find any meaning in their life. They have no meaningful connections to other people, no real friends, no real community, they're not attached to any of the work that they do, and have minimal to no genuine human interaction. Life is dull, boring, lonely, atomized, and alienating. But that's another key word here too, alienating. Alienation isn't just a description of dullness in everyday life or the lack of real meaning in someone's life. As Robert Nisbet so perfectly stated in The Quest for Community, alienation is the state of mind that can find a social order remote, incomprehensible, or fraudulent, beyond real hope or desire, inviting apathy, boredom, or even hostility. The individual not only does not feel a part of the social order, he has lost all interest in being a part of it. But to start, I'm going to try and convince you of the seriousness of the loneliness epidemic we're facing in this country, and really around most of the West. And we'll start by touching base with some of the previous statistics mentioned in the beginning of the video. First and foremost, friends. The more isolated and atomized our lives become, and the more fractured and diverse our lifestyles are, the less desire or capability there seems to be in forming real connections with people, especially when we only seem to interact with people through a digital screen. But friendships are a really important part of people's lives. They're the people you turn to for help in dire straits, people you bond with, reciprocate with, and practice your virtues with. The history of friendships in the 19th century paints a far more intimate picture than friendships today. But something like the ideal friendship is one more along the lines of Mr. Frodo and Sam. You know they're looking out for one another and that they want the best outcome for each, and together they're able to practice their virtues and bring out the best in each other. It's about as real a friendship as it gets. And this is distinct from other types of friendships, or specifically acquaintances. Friends that you only have at the workplace are not the same as friends you meet every week at the bar, or at your book club or church, and go hiking with. Even Aristotle understood this hundreds of years ago in his Nicomachean Ethics, where he describes the friendship of utility, which is the type of friendship that is most common at your work or business. You don't live with these people, and for the most part, there isn't a compassionate relationship, and their only use to you is insofar as you need them to complete your own work. Other than that, you'll probably never see them outside the workplace. This is about as basic as it gets. It's not terrible, but it's definitely not anything meaningful or deep, or even fulfilling. The highest form of friendship, according to Aristotle, is what he calls the perfect friendship. Perfect friendship is the friendship of men who are good and alike in virtue, for these wish well alike to each other qua good, and they are good themselves. But this is also the kind of friendship that takes work. Such friendship requires time and familiarity. As the proverb says, men cannot know each other till they have eaten salt together, nor can they admit each other to friendship or be friends till each has been found lovable and been trusted by each. And where else do you find those shared virtues, values, and morals than in the space provided by civil society? Where else do you find trust in someone and know that you can come together and pursue the same moral purpose and goals with one another than by engaging in a setting that allows both of you to act on your virtues? People require other people in order to be virtuous themselves. Personally, one of the things that's been more common over the course of the last few years has been hearing from my own grandparents about all the people they used to know who have either disappeared from their lives or have just died of old age. I constantly hear from my grandmother, "I used to know so many people in this town. Now I hardly know anyone. And all the people I did know are either all dead or moved elsewhere." Something meaningful has been lost from her. She's obviously not happy when she says things like this. And the same goes for all of your grandparents who say the same thing. Old friends, associations, family, all slowly going away. And it's sad. But here's the thing, at least they get to say that. At least they did have something, someone in their lives. You can't really say the same thing for the person who's become totally isolated from everyone else. He can't lose anyone because he never had anything. He's never had the opportunity to share a relationship with as wide a variety of people as my grandmother has. And this woman knows everyone in this town. But here's the thing about isolation. Isolation will have detrimental effects on your mental health. Emil Durkheim, the founder of the field of sociology, wrote in his highly influential monogram from 1897, Suicide, A Study in Sociology, that the more weakened the groups to which he, the man, belongs, the less he depends on them. The more he consequently depends only on himself and recognizes no other rules of conduct than what are founded on his private interests. And that if you do not have strong social relationships, you are at a higher propensity to kill yourself. Jonathan Haidt goes further into this when he writes in the Happiness Hypothesis that 100 years of further studies have confirmed Durkheim's diagnosis. If you want to predict how happy someone is, or how long she will live, if you are not allowed to ask about her genes or personality, You should find out about her social relationships. Having strong social relationships strengthens the immune system, extends life, more than does quitting smoking, speeds recovery from surgery, and reduces the risk of depression and anxiety disorders. Arthur Brooks in Love Your Enemies cites an observation by neuroscientist Matthew Lieberman in his book Social, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Connect, where he concludes that simply having a friend you see on most days gives the equivalent happiness boost of earning an additional $100,000 of income each year. Seeing your neighbors on a regular basis gives as much happiness as an extra $60,000. And as stated in The Atlantic, if you volunteer at least once a week, the increase to your happiness is like moving from a yearly income of $20,000 to $75,000. Meanwhile, the experience of breaking a critical social tie, such as with a family member, is like experiencing a large income decline. And a study of over 300,000 people from Brigham Young University psychologists showed that individuals with adequate social relationships have a 50% greater likelihood of survival compared to those with poor or insufficient social relationships. The magnitude of this effect is comparable with quitting smoking, and it exceeds many well-known risk factors for mortality. Harvard Medical School says that this has an effect on mortality risk roughly comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Or in other words, loneliness is as lethal as smoking 15 cigarettes per day. And in an almost 80-year-long study directed by Robert Waldinger at Harvard, he concluded that taking care of your body is important, but tending to your relationships is a form of self-care too. That, I think, is the revelation. Loneliness kills. It's as powerful as smoking or alcoholism. In fact, as Mary Eberstadt notes in her book Primal Screams, the rise in loneliness studies in academia is one of the fastest growing topics of interest in the West today. Clearly something is going on here. And in his book Them, Senator Ben Sasse gives a really telling example of the extent of the loneliness epidemic by using the example of the 1995 Chicago heatwave. So what happened in the summer of 1995 was that Chicago experienced the deadliest heatwave in US history. The heat index at Midway Airport was at 120 degrees, and the Chicago Tribune described the humidity like you were roasting under a wet wool blanket. And at night, the temperatures only got down to the high 80s. It was hot, and the city was not built for that kind of heat. Many residents did not have air conditioning, and those who did ran their units so relentlessly that parts of the power grid collapsed. Electricity went out across the city, leaving people to bake in brick apartments. After the heatwave passed, coroners originally counted 465 dead, but it wasn't until weeks later, when the stench of decomposition oozed from homes and apartments, that researchers found that the total was closer to 739. How did a city of 2.8 million people miss almost 300 extra bodies? Well, sociologist Eric Klinenberg looked into it. As Ben Sasse explains his findings, the crucial variable, Klinenberg discovered, was social relationships. In neighborhoods that fared well during the heatwave, residents knew who was alone, who was old, and who was sick, and took it upon themselves to do wellness checks. They encouraged neighbors to knock on each other's doors, not because the heatwave was so exceptional, but because that's what they always do. By contrast, areas with high death tolls were areas that had been previously abandoned by businesses, service providers, and most residents. Only the unconnected remained. They died alone because they lived alone. In the final analysis, the difference between life and death, Klinenberg's heatwave, a social autopsy of disaster in Chicago concluded, was connections, or what he labeled social infrastructure. Isolation turned something dangerous into something deadly. Richard Keller also notes a similar incident in his book Fatal Isolation, the devastating Paris heatwave of 2003, which took 35,000 lives across Europe. Mary Eberstadt writes that part of the contributing factor for the size of that catastrophe was the simple fact that these victims were poor in family. Many died because they did not have what other human beings throughout history have been able to count on, loved ones to spirit them away from a disaster. A similar phenomenon has been going on in Japan, though not of any heatwave, but just out of sheer loneliness. As Eberstadt notes from a New York Times article in 2017, by the end of 2016, there were 4,000 lonely deaths a week. Each year, some of Japan's elderly died without anyone knowing, only to be discovered after their neighbors caught the smell. And this next point was particularly disturbing. The story goes on to note that generations of empty cradles have also given rise to a new industry, firms that clean out the apartments of the isolated dead, because no family members remain to do it. According to another recent report in The Independent, such cleanup outfits are burgeoning, and insurance companies now offer policies to protect landlords in case a lonely happens on their property. If you don't think that isolation and loneliness are serious problems, maybe you do now. And it's not just old people, but young people as well, across the Western world. Isolation can also be unintentionally placed upon children through their own parents. We live in a time with a lot of distractions, and a lot of people are simply not interested in raising children with deep moral purpose. And if that's the case, then I'll just give 6-year-old Jimmy an iPhone and let that raise him. Now I can sit back and rewatch that Netflix show I've already seen 50 times. According to a report by Influence Central, the average age for a child getting their first phone is 10.3 years old, and tablets have taken off in usage from 26% to 55% for road trips. The 2016 survey also shows that parents' grip on kids' electronics loosened up a bit, with the percentage who impose strict limits on where and when kids can use technology/electronics declining from 49% to 41% over 4 years, while those with some limits up from 44% to 50%. 39% of kids get a social media account at 11.4 years. 11% got an account when they were younger than 10. So essentially, by age 12, 50% of children have social media accounts. Why is this not good? Because we know that this can perpetuate feelings of isolation and loneliness. In a study from 1998, researchers at Carnegie Mellon University found that greater use of the internet was associated with declines in participants' communication with family members in the household, declines in the size of their social circle, and increases in their depression and loneliness. And from research cited by Jean Twenge in her book iGen, 8th graders who frequently use social media increase their risk of depression by 27%. And in an article by Twenge from The Atlantic, teens who spend 3 hours a day or more on electronic devices are 35% more likely to have a risk factor for suicide, such as making a suicide plan. That's much more than the risk related to, say, watching TV. And along with that, teens who spend 3 or more hours a day on electronic devices are 28% more likely to get less than 7 hours of sleep than those who spend fewer than 3 hours. And teens who visit social media sites every day are 19% more likely to be sleep deprived. And according to a Stanford Medicine article, sleep deprivation increases the likelihood teens will suffer myriad negative consequences, including an inability to concentrate, poor grades, drowsy driving conditions, anxiety, depression, thoughts of suicide, and even suicide attempts. And what is the one thing that seems to offset depression in kids and teenagers? Well, as Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt write in The Coddling of the American Mind, kids who spend more hours per week doing sports and other forms of exercise, attending religious services, reading books and other print material, in-person social interactions, and homework have far lower rates of depression. If this is the kind of stuff you are allowing your child to be frequently engaged in, do not be surprised if they become more depressed and anxious people. And this is especially true for women. I've mentioned in a previous video that women now get plastic surgery to look like the perfect Snapchat filter models, because they are so insecure about their natural looks. And according to a January 2019 study from the University of Essex and University College London, girls' depression scores went up 50% compared to 35% for boys from social media use, especially if you're using Instagram. The site encourages its users to present an upbeat, attractive image that others may find at best misleading and at worst harmful. If Facebook demonstrates that everyone is boring, and Twitter proves that everyone is awful, Instagram makes you worry that everyone is perfect, except you. And in a 2017 Royal Society for Public Health charity, they found that Instagram scored the worst for its effects on sleep, body image, and FOMO, or the fear of missing out. As Lukianoff and Haidt write, by 2016, roughly 1 out of every 5 girls reported symptoms that met the criteria for having experienced a major depressive episode in the previous year. And it's not just anxiety and depression that comes with the internet, but returning to the previous topic of internal decay, it promotes a kind of individualized lifestyle. You can pretty much tailor your life in the way you want to, in such minute and diverse ways that you essentially become a world unto yourself. Just think how many millions of channels there are on YouTube, and all the variety of content each offers. You can live your life in such a way where all you watch on YouTube is ghetto house music, Clayworld, and dank meme compilations. Meanwhile, someone else has catered their experience to see makeup artists and fashion gurus, and ESPN highlight videos. Oh, and with a little bit of prison school anime thrown in there. The fact is, the more personalized your digital life is, which increasingly takes up more of people's time, the more disconnected you're going to be from everyone else. Culturally, there will be a disconnect. Everyone is not watching the same 3 channels on their TV box anymore. They're watching all the millions of programs on however many streaming platforms there are out there. Now that's not necessarily bad. I like my variety, and I like my ghetto house music and Clayworld. I like the fact that Canopy exists. That's the only place where I watch my movies now. But this does lead to a fracturing of social cohesion and the commonality of shared experiences. The extent of the customization that occurs in your private life will have a detrimental effect on your public life when you no longer find it sufficient to fulfill your needs, and then you just retreat back into the digital world or into yourself. And why wouldn't you? You can be a warrior online. You can kill baddies and rank up in competitive mode, dude. You can learn all the sweet new tricks and superficial makeup techniques. You can learn which protein shakes best supplement your epic workout routine so you can look like the you've always wanted to look like. Hi, I'm Political Juice, and here at the Political Juice Corporation, we think that we can turn your biggest weaknesses into your greatest opportunity. Everything is centered around you. There is no emphasis on your community, or what you and your neighbors can do together, or build together. It's all centered around you and how best to personalize your life experience. You will no longer find community in real people and real experiences, or at least have a more difficult time of it, compared to the personalized and digital experiences isolated within your home. And it feels so good, except when it doesn't. This also raises certain questions about identity. How do you define yourself when you're thrown into a world where you can essentially see everyone? Where what you see online determines how you interpret your self-worth? As Mary Eberstadt notes in her book Primal Screams, the immediacy of the internet throws gasoline on the burning question of identity in several ways, by showing the have-nots what the haves enjoy in a more up-close and personal way than ever before, by handing the angry and discontented a new power of convening, by making solipsistic silos a go-to, and, above all, by delivering simulacrums of groups and friends into a world in which many souls are already lacking the real-life version of both. Now we'll get back to Mary Eberstadt later, but I think we can do well by looking at a recent materialization of this phenomenon. I think one of the things that best represents this question of identity and isolation among young Americans right now, and particularly for a certain subgroup of men in the age of the internet, from their late teens to maybe mid-30s, is found in the doomer meme. If you're not aware of what exactly this meme is, it is a reflection of a young American male who has generally become aware of a seeming meaninglessness in the world and in his own life, and has lost almost all of his friends, or simply has no friends, lives a depressed life alienated from any genuine human connection and the rest of society, and has fallen into the perpetual trap of intense nostalgia for a more innocent and wholesome past, all the while succumbing to bad habits and drug addiction, which further perpetuates the cycle of his isolation and strengthens the grasp of his depression. It is a meme that mixes the ideas of what seems to be an ironic awareness of self-loathing, misery, and utter alienation. There is something that is true about this person that hundreds of thousands of young people see being reflected in their own lives. And I don't think the fact that many of these people are also highly attached to the internet is an insignificant factor here. But I think this video in particular, by a channel that frequently promulgates this type of material, seems to perfectly represent this. And it has clearly made an impact on hundreds of thousands of people that can relate to it on some level. But a deeper look at this one video perfectly illustrates the issues I've been talking about throughout this entire video. The character wakes up, showers, and eats his breakfast. The character is so tired and depressed that he needs 2 energy drinks, a cup of coffee, and a bottle of caffeinated water to get him going. He also has to take vitamin D pills, likely due to the lack of exposure to the sun, and omega-3, either for depression or general brain and heart health. Also, in most iterations at least, the character seems to have a smoking addiction. He then proceeds to go to work and get stuck in traffic. When he arrives at work, his boss scolds him for being late. But something in his behavior also changes. He now pretends to keep up with appearances, trying not to look miserable or draw any unwanted attention until he gets to his cubicle where he works for the next 12 hours. He sits at his desk all day long until it's time to go home. But before that, his boss asks him if he can come into work the next day. He then drives home, eats dinner with a beer, the character is also portrayed as an alcoholic at times, and he spends the rest of his night on his computer scrolling through the internet. He then cries himself to sleep in the middle of the night. The cycle repeats all over again, day by day, until he finally has a mental breakdown. Looking at what's missing from the Doomer's life is very similar to the analysis of the life of Julia. Except in this comparison, the life of Julia can essentially be seen as the more glorified version of the Doomer meme. The Doomer seemingly has no family. He has no friends. He has no wife, girlfriend, child, anything. He likely doesn't even know his neighbors. When he goes to work, he doesn't talk to anyone. He doesn't seem to know anyone, and the only person that does talk to him is his boss, who either reprimands him or asks him to work more days. More than that, everyone else at the office looks exactly like him. It's almost as if he's just reflecting himself onto everyone else there, and putting up a front of false emotions into a world that he already sees as being fraudulent, which only serves to alienate him even further from the rest of his immediate environment and from genuine human contact, as well as reinforce a kind of solipsism. The Doomer has no serious connection or passion for his work, and as is usually implied in the meme, the only purpose for working is money for basic survival. There is no higher purpose or meaning attached to the work. After work, he goes straight home. He does not belong to any other organization, no volunteer group, no association of any kind, no church, no friends, no book club, nothing. He knows no one else, nor belongs to anything that actually needs him or makes him feel as though he is needed. So he goes on the internet all by himself for a couple of hours, until he goes and cries himself to sleep in the middle of the night. This person has become so isolated from the rest of the world that he has absolutely nothing in his life worth living for. All of the mediating institutions of civil society have either failed this individual or are completely invisible to him. His only relationship in life is between himself, his job that he despises, and the digital world, which is the closest thing to a community he can find, as evidenced by many of the adherents of the meme. And if you compound his already terrible smoking habit with the previously mentioned statistic of loneliness being as lethal as smoking 15 cigarettes per day, then you know that this person is living an incredibly miserable life. Now we'll return to this in a moment, But one of the more interesting factors surrounding depression that Jacqueline Olds and Richard Schwartz make the case for in their book The Lonely American, which Ben Sasse repeats in his book Them, is that, quote, much of what is called depression might actually be chronic loneliness. They observed in their practices that many of their patients' descriptions of depression were tied to accounts of isolation. We began to notice how hard it was for our patients to talk about their isolation, which seemed to fill them with deep shame, they write. Most of our patients were more comfortable saying they were depressed than saying they were lonely. When Senator Sasse went around asking various psychiatrists and psychologists about whether they noticed anything similar, a flood of agreement followed, with one therapist exclaiming, "Oh heavens, yes. The number one reason people think they're coming into my office is self-diagnosed depression. But most of the time, my conclusion is that their challenge is a lack of community and healthy relationships. My fear is that my profession is just prescribing them a medication, because that's the easiest path out of the appointment." And it's more than likely that a significant portion of our country's consumption of opioids in the last few decades is to cope with the despair of loneliness, or what Andrew Sullivan calls in New York Magazine, existential pain. The oxytocin we experience from love or friendship or orgasm is chemically replicated by the molecules derived from the poppy plant. It's a shortcut, and an instant intensification of the happiness we might ordinarily experience in a good and fruitful communal life. To see this epidemic as simply a pharmaceutical or chemically addictive problem is to miss something. The despair that currently makes so many want to fly away. Opioids are just one of the ways Americans are trying to cope with an inhuman new world where everything is flat, where communication is virtual, and where those core elements of human happiness, faith, family, community, seem to elude so many. Until we resolve these deeper social, cultural, and psychological problems, until we discover a new meaning, or reimagine our old religion, or reinvent our way of life, the poppy will flourish. And as Michael Chalmers, the publisher of the Observer newspaper in West Virginia, told a reporter in the New Yorker, in my opinion, the desperation in the Panhandle and places like it is a social vacancy. People don't feel like they have a purpose. Many drug addicts, he explained, are trying to escape the reality that this place doesn't give them anything. In 2017, 70,237 people died of a drug overdose. The suicide rate in our country has risen by 25.4% from 1999 to 2016. There were 44,965 deaths by suicide in 2016, with over 1.3 million adults having attempted suicide within the past year. In 2017, there were 47,173 deaths by suicide, with over 1.4 million people attempting suicide. Suicide was the second leading cause of death among individuals between ages 10 and 34, and there were more than twice as many suicides in the US as there were homicides. More millennials than ever before are dying these deaths of despair, all involving drugs, alcohol, and suicide. Between 2007 and 2017, drug-related deaths increased by 108% among adults ages 18 to 34, while alcohol-related deaths increased by 69% and suicide increased by 35%. Altogether, about 36,000 millennials died of deaths of despair in 2017, with fatal drug overdoses being the biggest driver. A fall 2018 study from the American College Health Association found that 55.1% of all undergraduates felt that things were hopeless within the last 12 months. 65% said they felt very lonely. 62.9% said they felt overwhelming anxiety. 12.7% said they seriously considered suicide. And 42.7% said that they felt so depressed that it was difficult to function. There is a reason why people now talk about the quarter-life crisis. People in their late teens and early 20s are absolutely miserable. They are meaningless, they don't know what to do with themselves, and they see absolutely no hope in the future. This is why the Doomer character is really interesting to me. He's a 21st century internet age embodiment of this sentiment among young people, channeled through one of the only sources of community we now have, the internet. And yet the sentiment always seems like it has to be made in an ironic kind of suffering, because talking about the truth dead on is always more agonizing. But the reality of these statistics also does a number on the belief held by many nowadays that if only we just give people more money, then they'll have all the leisure time in the world to go out in their communities, write poetry, and produce art. No. Unfortunately, when you give people a lot of money with no expectations for it, they will stay at home, watch TV, binge on the internet, and as is becoming more and more common nowadays, shoot up all sorts of opiates and other drugs because they are so miserable and lack any meaningful things to do in their lives, and they need to feel some sort of mental stimulation and satisfaction because they have no community to get that satisfaction from. And also, we just discussed this in the section on the decline of work. Giving people what is essentially guaranteed free money with no expectations in return is one of the more baffling ideas people have come up with. This is why I'm so against the idea of a universal basic income in our current situation, which not only would cost us $3.8 trillion every year, but we already tried it and it doesn't work. As Noah Rothman detailed in an article and commentary, the negative income tax, as it was called, was essentially a minimum income that phased out as earnings increased. In 1968, the White House Office of Economic Opportunity selected a series of communities in New Jersey to test the NIT. The number of hours worked by the program's beneficiaries declined, and those who lost a job while on this form of assistance took longer to find new work than those without it. What's more, as the Stanford Research Institute found, the experiment did not increase nuclear family cohesion. Instead, it exacerbated the conditions that were leading families to come apart. The SRI researchers, the study read, hypothesized that the ability of the income guarantee to some families reduced the pressure on the breadwinner to remain with the family, while the benefit reduction rate also reduced the value to the family of keeping a wage earner in the unit. As was stated earlier by Charles Murray, taking the trouble out of life strips people of major ways in which human beings look back on their lives and say, "I made a difference." Now, returning back to the Doomer meme, one might think that this video is a bit ridiculous. It is a meme after all. Yes, I get that. But I am also operating on the internet here, and I am also a young Gen Zer myself who knows what goes on with internet culture. And this is one of those moments when the meme transcends its format and actually finds spiritual connection with people. And besides that, there are countless videos on this character that people have made, with thousands of people commenting on how identical this is to their lives and how miserable they are. There's even a video out there that tries to philosophize the Doomer meme, which to date has over 2 million views. This is not just your ordinary meme. This seems to be either perfectly reflective of, or at least spiritually reflective, of a significant portion of young people, particularly men, and not just in our country, but around the world. And the nation that seems to have been hit with a version of this first is Japan. I've talked before about the group of socially isolated young Japanese males who have the designation of hikikomori, the term seemingly taking off from the mid to late 90s, and basically meaning a hermit. Some of these men do not leave their homes for months, and spend their time playing video games or watching anime. And if they do go out, they usually only do so at night, because it's simply more comfortable for them and they do not want to be seen by people. According to a BBC article, the Japanese government estimates that there are roughly 541,000, or 1.57% of the population, that are considered hikikomori. But many experts believe that the total is much higher, as it can take years before they seek help. The condition was initially thought to be unique to Japan, but in recent years, cases have appeared across the world. In neighboring South Korea, a 2005 analysis estimated that there were 33,000 socially withdrawn adolescents, 0.3% of the population. And in Hong Kong, a 2014 survey pegged the figure at 1.9%. It's not just in Asia. Cases are appearing in the US, Spain, Italy, France, and elsewhere. Whether due to increased awareness or a growing problem remains unclear, but a concern about social isolation is on the rise globally. In January 2018, the UK appointed its first Minister for Loneliness, and recent Office of National Statistics data found nearly 10% of 16 to 24-year-olds reported feeling always or often lonely. But just as with Americans disaffected from the communities and work, as well as the Americans perturbed by a global economy, the Doomer also seeks institutional change from the government, or at least a grasp on power. You can find many comments from these people on these Doomer videos calling for some kind of revolution, or some sort of change from the government. Very often, you'll also see people quoting lines from the movie Fight Club, which is one of the more quintessential tear down the system movies, or people scapegoating the Jews for all their problems. And compared to the more traditional political classes of middle-aged or older Americans, the Doomer seems to have a much greater tendency for deracination. Now, this might just be due to a type of youthful idealism, or the belief held by many young people that they can just easily change the world or bring about some grand revolution that most older people seem to grow out of. But one thing is for certain though, all of these frustrated classes look to the biggest source of power and homogenization that exists: the federal government. It's that same human instinct. The closer you feel as though you can wield the reins of power and feel as though you are collectivizing a portion of society, the more you feel a part of something greater, part of a group of real revolutionaries, a unified tribe that can come around a common purpose, a family. I mean, there is a reason why one of the hotbeds of Nazism was found among the youth at the time. As Richard Grunberger wrote in the 12-Year Reich, in 1927, during a time of general prosperity, 77% of Prussian students insisted that the Aryan paragraph, barring Jews from employment, be incorporated into the charters of German universities. 60% of all German undergraduates supported the Nazi student organization. And as Joachim Fest writes in The Face of the Third Reich, as early as March 3, 1933, 300 university teachers of all political persuasions declared themselves for Hitler in an election appeal, while the mass of students had gone over to the National Socialist camp considerably earlier. As early as 1931, the National Socialist Party, with 50 to 60% of the votes, enjoyed almost twice as much support in the universities as in the country as a whole. And as Gerhard Rempel lays out in a chart from Hitler's Children, in 1928, the Hitler Youth had around 10,000 members. Just 5 years later, that number went up to 2.2 million, and a year after that, in 1934, it went up to 3.5 million. By 1940, membership was up to 8 million. The same can also be said about the young culture revolutionaries in Red China. The Red Guards were an organization comprised mostly of students, hunting down and seeking out any dissenters because nothing can interfere with our grand vision and the purpose it gives us all. It's said that membership in the Red Guards reached as high as 11 million. These students quite literally had nothing else to belong to in their societies other than the state. There is a very long literature with nearly all forms of socialism or fascism where the main object of collectivizing society is so that people no longer feel lonely, so they can all belong to a community of people and never again feel the anxiety of isolation, that they can finally be a part of one big tribal family. Edward Bellamy, considered one of the godfathers of American socialism, based his entire philosophy on this idea, where he wanted to escape the anxiety of his own individuality and merge with the collective of the industrial society. As he writes, "Who has not felt in sudden shocks of feeling as if the sense of personal identity, i.e., sense of his connection with his particular individuality, were slipping from him?" Bellamy could not stand his own personal isolation. He could not stand the agony that burden placed onto him. And so as Arthur Lippow writes about Bellamy's philosophy, it was centered around the desire for communion, the powerful expression of a yearning to immerse the individual personality in an impersonal, infinite universe, thereby escaping the anxiety of individual existence. Only to the extent that men attain communion with the impersonal universe and cast off their individual identities do they realize their higher natures and achieve that solidarity with other souls that ends isolation. Bellamy quite literally wanted the idea of the nation as a family. But when you are channeling your isolation into an effort to build a totalizing community on the national scale, understand that is just not how human beings associate. You do not live on the national scale. You live in your local community. Or as Ross Douthat writes, the mass community offered by totalitarianism may be more attractive than no community at all, but it remains a deeply unnatural form of human association. This might be why so much of our social media interactions descend into utter chaos. We weren't meant to be able to communicate with and have access to every single person on the planet, each with their own moral paradigms and thought processes and ways of living. It creates disorder. Humans like some degree of consistency. Local communities, before the internet, generally provided that. You knew what your town was all about, what its people did, what they believed, and what kinds of behaviors they did or didn't tolerate. And you got your meaning from being a part of that. Social media is like a sledgehammer to all of that. It provides too much disorder, and hence you get threads on Twitter or YouTube of people just raging at each other for not believing the same thing that they do. But much like in the case of nearly all totalitarian governments in history, the attempt to make whole and homogenize the entire nation always descends into chaos and tyranny, because you don't live with the entire nation. You live in it, in your own small little corner of the nation, with the people around you and the interactions and civil associations that you take part in within that small corner. When the former Texas Senator Phil Gramm was talking to a group of voters, he said to the crowd something along the lines of, "My policy comes from the fact that no one loves my children more than my wife and I do." And then a woman in the audience shouted back and said, "That's not true. I love your children as much as you do." And then he replied back to her, "Oh yeah? Then what are their names?" You can't possibly know all of these things because you don't live on that kind of unnatural scale where you would know these things. As Robert Nisbet wrote in The Quest for Community, the genius of totalitarian leadership lies in its profound awareness that human personality cannot tolerate moral isolation. It lies further in its knowledge that absolute and relentless power will be acceptable only when it comes to seem the only available form of community and membership. And he cites a passage from Hitler's Mein Kampf. The mass meeting is necessary if only for the reason that in it, the individual, who in becoming an adherent of a new movement feels lonely and is easily seized with the fear of being alone, receives for the first time the picture of a greater community, something that has a strengthening effect upon most people. And as Arthur Lippow writes about 19th century American socialists, they wanted to harmonize the individual with society or the state, and in doing so provide a collective family. Hannah Arendt also came to a very similar conclusion in her own book on the origins of totalitarianism, where she notes the similar conditions of isolation and loneliness that helped to spawn both Stalinist Russia and Nazi Germany. Now, I'm not saying doomers are all Nazis or communists, though the alt-right tendency does seem to run deep for a good portion of them, but I am merely reflecting how that youthful instinct for wanting to belong to a cause larger than oneself is essentially universal, especially when you don't have anything else to belong to, as is the case with a growing number of young people, and as is being made explicit here. In the more mainstream world of politics, middle Americans are finding their meaning and sense of community in making America great again, in the actions of our commander-in-chief. Millions of people legitimately believe that one person controlling the reins of government power can bring back their communities for them, instead of themselves going out and rebuilding that community. In fact, the sense of alienation among the American right could very well be the reason for a kind of revival of nationalism that seems to be going on. For liberals, they find their meaning in a vision of a technocratic consolidation of federal power and welfare redistribution. For a long time now, it has been a political constituency that sees one of the only sources of purpose coming from their ability to reform and engineer society by means of the most powerful source of authority. Ironically, for a political coalition that seemingly despises materialism and unwarranted authority, their main considerations are entirely material and driven by claims to power. And for the young doomer, well, it's just tearing down the system, or something. If the constant allusions to Fight Club are any indicator, it's likely that. F the system.
System rules you, kid. Always has.
Which, the idea of tearing it all down isn't really original as it pertains to the human instinct and its tension with modernity, and as Jonah Goldberg lays out in Suicide of the West, is a pretty common trope in cinema.
This was never about money for us, it was about us against the system. That system that kills the human spirit. We stand for something. To those dead souls inching along the freeways in their metal coffins, we show them that the human spirit is still alive.
The Matrix is a system, Neo. That system is our enemy. But when you're inside, you look around, what do you see? Businessmen, teachers, lawyers, carpenters, the very minds of the people we are trying to save. But until we do, these people are still a part of that system, and that makes them our enemy. You have to understand, most of these people are not ready to be unplugged. And many of them are so inert, so hopelessly dependent on the system, that they will fight to protect it.
Man, I see in Fight Club the strongest and smartest men who've ever lived. I see all this potential, and I see it squandered. God damn it, an entire generation pumping gas, waiting tables, slaves with white collars. Advertising has us chasing cars and clothes, working jobs we hate so we can buy shit we don't need. We're the middle children of history, man. No purpose or place. We have no Great War, no Great Depression. Our Great War is a spiritual war. Our Great Depression is our lives. We've all been raised on television to believe that one day we'd all be millionaires and movie gods and rock stars, but we won't. We're slowly learning that fact. And we're very, very pissed off.
What is it about society that disappoints you so much?
Oh, I don't know. Is it that we collectively thought Steve Jobs was a great man, even when we knew he made billions off the backs of children? Or maybe it's that it feels like all our heroes are counterfeit. The world itself's just one big hoax. Spamming each other with our burning commentary bullshit masquerading as insight. Our social media faking as intimacy. Or is it that we voted for this? Not with our rigged elections, but with our things, our property, our money. I'm not saying anything new. We all know why we do this, not because Hunger Games books makes us happy, but because we want to be sedated. Because it's painful not to pretend. Because we're cowards. Fuck society.
This show is too woke. Is this sad that he's actually right? This explains my social anxiety. This show has awoken me. We live in a society. As Goldberg writes, the idea that the world, this world, is wrong, off balance, fake, fraudulent, unnatural, has been one of the dominant themes of art since the Enlightenment. It's what motivated the Romantic poets to fight back against what they saw as the mechanization of natural life. So you can go back in history to guys like Emerson and Thoreau and essentially find the 1840 version of Fight Club.
Like so many others, I had become a slave to the IKEA nesting instinct.
Or even further to Rousseau, who wanted to free man from his chains and get us all back to a natural state of being. Which, by the way, the noble savage was never a thing. And also, Rousseau never actually said that. He just made the idea of a noble savage popular. But aside from the more intelligible case of actual political coalitions, the doomer is so alienated from the rest of society that pretty much everything seems artificial and out of place. So he just kind of revels in a cynical self-hatred in various comment sections and forum boards. He doesn't belong in modern society, and he doesn't want to belong in modern society. The community of nihilistic commenters who share in the ideal of tearing it all down and bond over their despair becomes the new community for him, which is ironically an internet-based community, having little to no physical interaction with other people, with one of the only things that tempers that destructive impulse being the doomer's crippling depression. Irony. Again, the analogies to Fight Club are very apt. Moreover, it makes sense on some psychological level that some doomers would create a conspiracy around their own suffering. In this case, the Jews, or the subtler form of this, them. Much like those who see their problems being inflicted on them by the vast class of invisible globalists and deep state spies, or evil corporations and rich white men, the conspiratorial instinct runs deep in the human psyche, because we're so shocked at any instance of injustice or suffering, and we can't account for large probabilities, that we think that someone must have inflicted this on me. But the societal alienation is yet again where Robert Nisbet's 1953 book seems so prescient. As he writes, for a constantly enlarging number of persons, including, significantly, young persons of high school and college age, this state of alienation has become profoundly influential in both behavior and thought. Not all the manufactured symbols of togetherness, the ever-ready programs of human relations, patio festivals in suburbia, and our quadrennial crusades for presidential candidates hide the fact that for millions of persons, such institutions as state, political party, business, church, labor union, and even family have become remote and increasingly difficult to give any part of oneself to. And returning back to Mary Eberstadt's new book, Primal Screams, her thesis provides a lot of useful insight into what could possibly be going on here with this group of isolated youths and other identity groups of the last half century. As we've already laid out, human beings need structure, and from this structure, we are better able to figure out how to identify ourselves and our position in the world and set our own course for life. And much like our drive to find spiritual purpose, if these structures disappear, that doesn't subsequently remove our innate drive to want to identify ourselves. It's a part of human nature. Traditionally, this structure was found in the family. This is the first structure we are born into. And from that setting, along with our numerous siblings, and then our extended family, we receive a helpful guide as to where we belong in the world. I am a brother to my older sister and younger brother, and a cousin to my 7 other cousins. I have a lot of uncles, a lot of aunts, and 2 sets of grandparents. The psychological attachments made during childhood to these figures helps to structure our identities. But as Eberstadt's thesis goes, as the sexual revolution came in and completely reoriented the institutional purpose of the family and the orientation of each family member to one another, and as families continue their trend of having fewer children, with many kids being only childs, or simply growing up with a single parent in a broken household, you now have fewer sources of familial structure and stability to find your identity in from the moment you were born. The most basic structure that we are all born into and have developed in for tens of thousands of years has been collapsing. And as Eberstadt goes on to write, this collapse in the most primordial structure of family life could very well be the reason for the growth or attraction of identity politics over the last half century and its accompanying fanaticism. And it's especially interesting when you take into account what one of the very first identity politics group of the latter half of the 20th century was in this country, which as most academics and scholars have agreed upon, is the foundation of the Combahee River Collective Statement in 1974 and the rise of the Black feminists. They were early witnesses to the transformations that are now the stuff of daily conversation and reality for all, a world in which men have become ever less trustworthy and reliable, in which relations between the sexes have become chronically estranged and consumerist, and in which marriage has become thin on the ground. African American women were, and still are, disproportionately affected by abortion, out-of-wedlock births, fatherless homes, and related metrics. Is it any wonder then that one of the first identity politics groups of the 20th century started with black women? I mean, many African Americans growing up during the last 40 years do not know who their fathers are, and have lived in a household unnatural to the environment that we evolved in. That is a whole spiritual side of them that is simply missing. Many of my closest friends do not know who their fathers are. The same can also be said about Latino or Hispanic identity groups later on in the 20th century. And as the sexual revolution raged on, and families continued to decay, we now have the rise of various sexual identity groups, LGBTQ+, and the reverse classifications of cis-normative and the like. There is now a group of men out there who go under the banner of MGTOW, or men going their own way, who are completely swearing off any relationship with women, or at least any sort of long-term commitment with them. Like, that is now considered a major part of their identity. The sexual proclivities of people are now being used by them as a major identifier for their entire being, and they find community with others who also share in these immutable or preferential characteristics. The rise of all these identity groups reveals something more significant about what has happened to the human psyche in the last century. As Eberstadt writes, the formation of all these identity groups could very well be attempts at trying to answer the simple question, who am I? As our families collapse, as norms, institutions, structures, and sources of meaning in civil society decay, is it any wonder that people would seek out the most instinctual characteristics of their material body as the basis of their entire livelihoods? Is it any wonder now that as the white out-of-wedlock birth rate rises, white working class families are on the decline, and divorce on the rise, That there's now this movement of white identitarians and a kind of vile resurgence of white supremacy? Is it any wonder then that many of these groups tend to show a kind of infantilized rage and injustice at anything perceived as being a threat against their identity group or tribe? I mean, if your whole life is wrapped up in the identity you have created for yourself based on your immutable characteristics, and you perceive that to be under threat, is it not surprising that many of these people respond with an emotive rage and verbal vituperation?
Then why the f did you accept the position?
Because
Who
I have
the f hired you?
I have a different.
Blood and soil! Blood and soil!
You're useless. Get the f out of here. Transphobic piece of shit. Transphobic piece of shit.
Matt Walsh, Shabbos Goy, race traitor. That's what it is, folks. I know some people don't like to use that expression, but it's totally true. Throwing his own people under the bus. He hates white people. Nobody else talks like that about their own people except for white people, and it's gross. Pussy. Race traitor. You work for Jews, you know?
Do not interrupt me. I was not angry, and now I want your job to be taken from you. Okay? Understand that. Look me in my face, first of all, and understand that you are such a disappointment to this university, to your students, to yourself.
I am so mad! I am so fucking mad at these people! They don't do this to fucking me! We're gonna fucking ritualistically humiliate them! I am coming back here every fucking weekend if I have to. Like, this is never over! I win! They fucking lose! That's how the world fucking works! Little fucking c***s! They get ruled by people like me! Little fucking octoroons! My ancestors fucking enslaved those pieces of fucking shit! We're gonna win. I rule the fucking world!
I think it's especially profound to hear some of the latest stars of white nationalism talk about their identity. These people literally get in a fit of rage over the Jews or any perceived injustice aimed at their identity group because they see them as being an existential threat to the only identity they have, whiteness. As Mary Eberstadt writes, in social science, the toddler's developmental mind is known as the endowment effect, the idea that human beings ascribe extra value to possessions in virtue of the fact that they are theirs. Some scholars also see in the endowment effect a variation of another human proclivity, loss aversion. The growing attachment to identity politics can be seen as just one big shout for mine, like a child does, with all the rage and emotion accompanying it. This includes those of the alt-right and racialist European firsters. Mine is the primal cry, for example, of the white nationalist yearning for an ethno-state. One such group, the American Identity Movement, formerly Identity Europa, defined decolonization as a giant civilizational game of what's mine is mine and what's yours is also mine, a phrase literally ripped from a popular t-shirt for toddlers. Incidentally, one path-breaking 2018 study of white nationalists by the Institute for Family Studies at the University of Virginia turned up another finding that is grist for the mill of this book's thesis of a link between domestic disposition and identitarianism. White nationalists are much more likely to be divorced than married, or never married. Is it any wonder that the second anyone attempts to confront this group, they are barraged with nothing but insults like cuck, or other derogatory terms for homosexuals and racist slurs and the like? Remember, what is the most important thing about belonging to an unhealthy tribal group? Defending the tribe. Do not challenge our tribal identity or we will destroy you. These kinds of identity groups provide an extremely useful observational deck from which to view the most tribal human reactions as a result of the dissolution of proper family life and community. Almost all mammals and other reptiles and insects live in communal settings or families. As Eberstadt notes, there is no such thing as a lone wolf. That is a long-standing myth that has lasted for centuries. Wolves travel in families. Elephants, one of the most intelligent creatures on the planet, live in families. And more than that, they learn from their families. They learn who they are, what they are supposed to do, and they receive their sense of purpose from their position in their family. All animals engage in what is called social learning, by which they learn to express behaviors natural to their species by learning it from others. And Eberstadt lists a bunch of examples of how this happens. Cats that are stuck in trees are only stuck there because they were not taught how to get down. A barn cat, or a wild cat, is taught by their mother how to climb down from trees. A cat that has failed to receive this knowledge, or was taken away from birth before being taught such information, simply does not know how to act like a normal cat and get themselves down from a tree. Meerkats are taught by their older peers and family how to protect themselves from scorpions. Without being taught this, they don't know how to even approach a scorpion, and will probably get stung. Patagonian killer whales do not know how to beach themselves without being taught this action by their family members. Rhesus monkeys raised in a lab do not know that they should be fearful of snakes. But when they are placed in a group of monkeys raised in the wild, and then they see those monkeys lose their minds over seeing a snake, they immediately recognize that cognitive cue and learn to become fearful of snakes, and permanently. You put them back in a cage next to a snake, and they will have learned to be fearful of it. As Eberstadt notes from John Cacioppo and William Patrick in their book Loneliness, monkeys deprived of tactile comfort and also raised in isolation from other monkeys developed additional behavioral aberrations, from which they never recovered. They were overly aggressive with their playmates, and later in life they remained unable to form normal attachments. They were, in fact, socially inept, a decision that extended down into their most basic biological behaviors. And in the elephant community, as elephants continue to be poached and their families destroyed, younger elephants, without their older family members around, start showing highly aggressive aberrations in their behavior. But as soon as you place an older bull elephant next to them, they become stable again, and they start learning how to cope and become an actual elephant again. Their mere presence keeps younger bulls in social line. Young females taken from their mothers and allomothers turn out to lack maternal skills themselves, because they were unable to learn them in community. Animals in decimated herds exhibit the same traits as humans diagnosed with trauma disorder: abnormal startle response, unpredictable asocial behavior, inattentive mothering, and aggression. Some young bulls have so lost their sense of elephantness that they've taken to raping rhinos. Decades of serious insults to elephants' environment have so disrupted the intricate web of familial and societal relations by which young elephants have traditionally been raised in the wild, and by which established elephant herds are governed, that what we are now witnessing is nothing less than a precipitous collapse of elephant culture. There are serious problems that occur when species are deprived of their natural relational setting. There is a reason why we don't have a whole lot of circuses anymore. As Eberstadt quotes from John Coetzee, destroying the family life of highly social, intelligent animals leads inevitably to misery among individual survivors and pathological misbehavior among the group. And he's talking about elephants. Is it that much of a stretch to apply the same behaviors of other mammals deprived of their natural condition to humans? Humans who are now becoming more and more detached from family life, from community or church or other mediating institutions? These are institutional and structural settings that we are designed to learn from. For those that come from broken families, for those who are isolated from the communities, they are not learning these things. They are not learning how to be a properly functioning human being. And so they either live lives of agonizing isolation, find meaning in some tribal association of people, or more recently, identity politics groups. Or take our current political moment. Is it any wonder why people are so irascible now when confronting anything that approaches attacking their preconceived political convictions, toward the point of dehumanizing their political opponents? Their identities aren't centered around, say, being a sailor, or a football coach, or a mother, or a photographer, or a volunteer, or something associated with their jobs, hobbies, or other pastimes. It's all centered on their tribal attitudes toward immutable or preferential characteristics. And couple this notion of identity politics and all of the other factors that Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff write about in The Coddling of the American Mind, and you have some seriously anxious people who are incredibly insecure about their identity. People who are highly atomized and verging on utter alienation. And this is not natural. Is it any wonder that our newest generation of college students, many of whom seem to be increasingly coming from broken families and are offered no real meaning in their lives, are some of the first ones to take up the mantle of identity politics? Is it that much of a stretch to say that these broken people are trying to find community in the closest source of identity and belonging that they have available to them? I mean, it is an instinctual human desire to want to belong to something, anything. And this is also what Sebastian Junger does a fantastic job at detailing in his book Tribe, where even in the early colonial days, there were countless numbers of colonists who simply ran off from their towns and villages to join the Indians, and they preferred Indian life. As Junger writes, Benjamin Franklin pointed out, there were numerous settlers who were captured as adults and still seemed to prefer Indian society to their own. And as the French emigre Hector de Crèvecoeur wrote in 1782, thousands of Europeans are Indians, and we have no examples of even one of those aborigines having from choice become European. There must be in their social bonds something singularly captivating and far superior to anything to be boasted of among us. Simply put, for many colonists, Indian society offered a far greater communal atmosphere that they could belong to. Everyone within the tribe would collectively put their efforts together for the betterment of the tribe. And not only that, you live near everyone. Everyone visibly sees the work that they contribute. Everyone is close by and is needed. Everyone belongs in this sense. This is one of the reasons why the federal government specifically targeted Indian tribal solidarity in the 19th and 20th centuries with removal policies, allotment policies, and relocation. The strength of their communities was one of the most powerful bonds holding the tribes together. As described by religious historian Henry Warder Bowden in the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, all of Indian society's values emphasized the well-being of the collectivity rather than that of the individual. Personal distinction was shunned, not sought. Innovation was discouraged. Anyone who strove constantly to distinguish himself from his fellows was more likely to be ostracized and charged with witchcraft than to receive the admiration of his townspeople. Now, this is an interesting point to stop and really think about, especially in connection with the previous points made on the subject of government. Indian culture, Indian society, since before it even arrived in the Americas, or hell for that matter, in nearly all of human prehistorical societies, the ways in which human beings organize themselves in their bands of 150 or so people almost always had the same exact ethic. You work for the collective, don't distinguish yourself. Innovation is bad. Your personal achievements are not important. The group's achievements are. Your extended tribal kin. But then compare this with the view of individualism offered by those of Walter Rauschenbusch and Jane Addams. Individualism means tyranny. We must demand that the individual shall be willing to lose the sense of personal achievement and shall be content to realize his activity only in connection to the activity of the many. Or as Arthur Lippow describes the attitude of the early Bellamyite socialist movement in America, individualism was a fatal disease which would destroy the unity of the national organism. And in the tradition of most socialist, fascist, and Marxist philosophies, many of them are also centered around the collectivist society working toward the betterment of the group as a whole. Your distinction as an individual is dangerous to the thriving of the collective community. The same thing can also be said about nationalism, wherein most nationalist movements end up centralizing power in the national government for the supposed collective benefit of all. And nationalism isn't just a right-wing phenomenon, by the way. Almost all left-wing socialist movements around the world have had an impulse toward nationalism. Hell, the movement headed by Edward Bellamy and his compatriots called themselves the Nationalists. This is almost the same exact ethic or instinct going all the way back to the emergence of the first Homo sapiens. What this really says, and as was also noted by Jonah Goldberg in Suicide of the West, is that the inclination toward these types of worldviews is directly rooted in human nature. This style of thinking is natural. The socialistic inclination is natural. It is not only a reflection of the environment that we evolved in as humans, but it represents a direction in which our moral sense is bent towards. But because of the extent to which human society has advanced in the last 300 years, by progressively breaking out of the evolved nature of our species, and the individual freedom and liberty that has been obtained in much of the world because of that, this style of thinking, which is an attempt to return to our evolutionary past, is going backwards. These philosophies would almost invariably have to deny certain human rights, simply by starting with the freedom of association and basic economic liberties. The idea that socialist, fascist, and communist ideologies, as well as tribal and identity politics groups, seen through the lens of evolutionary anthropology, are taking us backwards, is where Calvin Coolidge's monolithic statement on the Declaration of Independence, one of the most important charters of freedom for the entire world, is so indispensable. About the Declaration, there is a finality that is exceedingly restful. It is often asserted that the world has made a great deal of progress since 1776, that we have had new thoughts and new experiences which have given us a great advance over the people of that day, and that we may therefore very well discard their conclusions for something more modern. But that reasoning cannot be applied to this great charter. If all men are created equal, that is final. If they are endowed with inalienable rights, that is final. If governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, that is final. No advance, no progress can be made beyond these propositions. If anyone wishes to deny their truth or their soundness, the only direction which he can proceed historically is not forward, but backward, toward the time where there was no equality, no rights of the individual, no rule of the people. Those who wish to proceed in that direction cannot lay claim to progress. They are reactionary. Their ideas are not more modern, but more ancient than those of the revolutionary fathers. All of this is why the book, The Lord of the Flies, is so significant, because it explores that inherent tension in human nature between destruction, order, and tribalism, and how thin that line is between civilization and barbarism.
The rules, you're breaking the rules. Who cares? Because the rules are the only thing we got. Bollocks to the rules. We're strong, we hunt. As a beast, we're hunted down and beat and beat.
Maybe there is a beast.
Hit him! He's got the conch.
What I mean is, maybe it's only us. Nuts!
This is also the tension that Friedrich Hayek writes about in The Fatal Conceit, and how attempts to indulge in our tribal instincts are antithetical to the rules of civilization. As we have seen, conflict between an individual's emotions and what is expected of him in an extended order is virtually inevitable. Innate responses tend to break through the network of learnt rules that maintain civilization. And as he goes on to write, only Rousseau provided literary and intellectual credentials for reactions that cultivated people once dismissed as simply uncouth. Regarding the natural, read instinctual, as good or desirable is, in his work, an expression of nostalgia for the simple, the primitive, or even the barbarian, based on the conviction that one ought to satisfy his or her desires, rather than obey shackles allegedly invented and imposed by selfish interests. But what many people don't seem to understand these days, and what needs to be repeated in every generation, is that if society is to advance, if society is to see true liberty and freedom, if you expect to see real material growth, the material growth that has allowed you to be able to watch the video you are watching right now on whatever device it is you are using, which was a product of the market system, the human dynamic that we evolved in is incompatible to the rules of modernity. If human society is to progress out of living in literal tribes, there has to be a separation from the communal setting of the small band and more focus on individual subsistence and achievement, which will come into conflict with evolved human instincts. There are trade-offs involved for the comforts and liberty that we are afforded by a modernized society. And if people really think that living in tribes in the forest is a better fit for them than the lives they live now, nothing's stopping you. And yet, I'm not seeing a huge swath of Americans living out in tribes in the forest somewhere. Lord Hugh Richard Heathcote Cecil made the same observation in 1912. The rise in the standard of comfort has been so great that what were deemed comforts or even luxuries are now indispensable to life and health. The hardiest laborer could not now live as a Saxon noble used to. And men are not only less robust, they are also dependent for the conditions of existence on complicated and artificial organization. As much as people will want to proclaim these days, largely as a result of a romanticized and nostalgic view of the past, you don't actually want to go back and be a farmer. It's not very fun work. It's called backbreaking for a reason, and it's why people migrated in droves to the cities. And as Jonah Goldberg goes at great lengths at detailing, there is a reason why the hockey stick graph of human progress is flatlined for hundreds of thousands of years before it takes off around 200 years ago. Because in order to achieve the material progress we have, we had to learn rules that were completely different from the rules of nature that we evolved in, the rules of our instincts, with one of the unfortunate consequences being an increase in human isolation and depression. Which is why civil society is so important. This space is necessary in order to channel our human instincts into productive and beneficial ends, to pursue happiness and live our lives in service to something greater than just ourselves. But as is my tendency to believe, there is no such thing as the good without the bad. You do not get the benefits of the internet without the resultant chaos of internet chat boards, addictive social media sites, and perverted and reprobate content like political juice. Pornography. You do not get the good of motor vehicle transportation without the bad of frequent deaths from car accidents. You do not get the material comforts and individual liberties of a free market liberal democratic society without the mental health issues and loneliness. Trade-offs are a part of life. But the crucial component here, the component that is absolutely necessary, is engagement with your local community through civil society. That is the healthiest outlet for getting isolated people out and involved in our society. It is the healthiest outlet for properly developing human beings, giving people purpose. We need to have associational life. Otherwise, we will seek to fulfill our instincts in more dangerous and unproductive ways. As Jonathan Haidt summarizes in the Happiness Hypothesis, Seneca was right. No one can live happily who has regard to himself alone and transforms everything into a question of his own utility. John Donne was right. No man, woman, or child is an island. Aristophanes was right. We need others to complete us. We are an ultra-social species, full of emotions finely tuned for loving, befriending, helping, sharing, and otherwise intertwining our lives with others. And this is where it seems like many libertarians and Republicans, and some self-described conservatives, have been getting their outlook wrong, where many respond to the growth of government and encroachment on their liberty in the space of civil society, not by promoting the sovereignty of their local communities, but by solely emphasizing individualism. When rights are being infringed, it's not just your rights as an individual that is at stake. It is also your right to exist as a member of your local community that's at stake. The sovereignty of your neighborhood. It is the very foundations of federalism that's at stake. This is why Ayn Rand is largely ignored in this view, because she rejects a lot of the communitarian virtues and the transcendent side of her being in favor of an individualist approach on par with guys like Thoreau and Emerson. When there are real, tangible things that matter in life, when the development of character and virtue are at stake, you can't be telling people to just let their freak flags fly, or do all the drugs you want in life, or to even live a life with an atomized focus on yourself, or you doing you. There is more meaning in life than that. There is more that must be found within the community you live in than that. And in our society, the good life is something that must be chosen and encouraged. Community and civil society are the best remedies we have for the spiritual and social poverty of our time. Doing things for your community and doing them with other people gives you an incredible sense of reward. You feel needed. You feel like you've made a difference in this world and have done real good. And you can see it right in front of your eyes because it is being done on the human and natural scale of your local community. In our civilization, civil society and mediating institutions are indispensable to our well-being and proper functioning. This is all we have to buttress against the challenges of human isolation that comes with modernity. Any other alternative is a cheap and destructive substitute for our nature. And with the state of isolation and alienation in our country being as prevalent as it is, rediscovering that faith in civil society becomes so much more important. As Yuval Levin writes, once more, it is the institutions of community and civil society that turn out to be most needful in our time.